Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on today's ESA webinar, How Government-Mandated Project Labor Agreements Will Harm the Economy, Workers, and Electronic Security and Life Safety Contractors. On February 4th, President Biden issued an executive order requiring project labor agreements on federal construction projects of $35 million or more. Additional Biden administration policies are pushing PLAs on federally funded projects procured by the state and local governments. PLAs are pre-hire collective bargaining agreements with labor unions that must be in place between contractors and their skilled workforce before contractors may bid on any covered contract or subcontract. Today, we'll dive deeper into the impacts this could have on the electronic security and life safety industry. We're joined by experts from ESA and ABC, and we thank PSA's security group for joining us in promoting today's webinar. I'm Jillian Bateman-McIntosh, ESA's Chief Development Officer, and I'm excited to lead today's webinar. Before we dive in, I'd like to provide some tips for those of you joining us on your first ESA webinar. Welcome. You will be muted for the duration of this session, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. If a question or comment comes to mind at any point during today's session, click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and I'll ensure we save some time for your questions with our experts today. We'll also be recording today's webinar so you can rewatch the on-demand session and share it with your colleagues. Tomorrow, you'll receive an email thanking you for your attendance with a link to the recording. If your company is a member of ESA, we thank you, and we hope you're utilizing your benefits to save, expand your team, and get connected to the ESA community. If you're not yet a member of the Electronic Security Association, check us out. ESA is the largest and longest standing association serving the pro-installed electronic security and life safety industry. Our members are integrators, dealers, monitoring centers, and even manufacturers and service providers in the space. You'd be surprised at the power an ESA membership holds for your company. Get a feel for all of the ESA benefits, including savings on business insurance, training, customized in-house onboarding and professional development programs, peer networking groups, government advocacy programs, certifications that satisfy state licensing, and in some cases are also alternatives to NICET at esaweb.org. Our membership specialists would be happy to walk you through the benefits and the application process. We at ESA realize your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending some of that time with us today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Heaton, Vice President of Advocacy and Public Affairs for ESA, and Ben Brubeck, Vice President of Regulatory, Labor, and State Affairs with the Associated Builders and Contractors. Chris, let's dive in.
Thank you, Jillian. Ben, I would just like to thank you for your time today and contributing to this important issue. You and your organization are really at the tip of the spear on project labor agreements, which is why I believe you would be the best person to lead this discussion. I'd also like to welcome PSA Security Network members to this discussion. My hope is that everyone will gain some valuable information from this webinar, and feel free to submit your questions as we move along. And with that, welcome, Ben, and feel free to proceed.
Well, Chris, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your leadership and your engagement on our coalition fighting back against government-mandated project labor agreements. Appreciate the kind introduction. And just real quick, tell your audience about ABC. We're Associated Builders and Contractors. We're a construction trade association representing about 21,000 general contractors, subcontractors, material suppliers, and other businesses in the construction industry. Our members mostly build commercial and industrial construction projects. We do have some residential home builders, but mainly in the multifamily space. And we've been around since 1950, and we've got 68 chapters across the country. So many of you probably are familiar with ABC in your local state capital or around the corner. We have workforce development, registered apprenticeship programs, networking events, and it's a great organization. And we're out there fighting for free enterprise and fair and open competition, the values of the merit shop. And I'm lucky in my role at ABC as part of our government affairs team to push back on overregulation and try to fight for fair and open competition for our members so that they can compete and they can build America. And that's a nice segue into what we're talking about today, which is government mandated project labor agreements. And as Jillian mentioned earlier, we've got a new executive order related to this. We've got some new policies come out of the Biden administration. And I'm getting lots of questions from people all in the construction ecosystem about, well, what exactly is this? The Biden administration is making this out like the greatest thing that we need to start exploring. And my understanding is it's problematic for our businesses, and I want to learn more about it. So Chris was kind enough to invite me to participate on this webinar. And today, my goal is really to give you guys sort of a three-part look at this issue. One is an overview of what exactly is a government mandated PLA, what are the arguments against it and the arguments for it. Two is to talk about the new policies that are coming out of the Biden administration and how that might impact your business and how that might impact taxpayers. And then three is to provide you with some action items that you can do to be advocates on this issue. And we'll take some questions kind of in between each of these little segments. And hopefully I'll have this all wrapped up in about 35 minutes. And then we'll have further discussion with Chris moderating going forward. So away we go. So people ask, what is a government mandated project labor agreement? And if you're not familiar, it's a job site specific, or sometimes it can be a multi-job site collective bargaining agreement. And when I say job site, that's an actual project, or it could be a number of projects like a school district and a number of schools that are being constructed at one time. The project labor agreements are mandated by a government entity in the actual procurement, and that usually is required via policy prior to issuance of the bid documents. And when I say policy, it could be through an executive order or an ordinance at the local level or legislation at the state level. And so those are in actual procurement for construction services in most instances. And there's really two parts to a project labor agreement as far as parties. One is the local unions with jurisdiction on the project. Those are the IBEW workers, the carpenters, the pipe fitters, the operating engineers. They are all signatory to this agreement. And generally could be 20 plus or more trades on there. And the PLA streamlines each of the union's individual collective bargaining agreements through the PLA, which is really a master collective bargaining agreement with respect to certain terms and conditions, which we'll talk about. But it also defers to the local collective bargaining agreements when it's not specifically addressed in the PLA. So if you're a contractor, you really have to know not only the PLA, but also individual collective bargaining agreements for each of the unions that are signatory. And like I said, the PLA sets terms and conditions related to union strikes, labor disruptions, a dispute resolution system on the labor front, union jurisdictions, which union is in charge of what kind of work, work hours, holidays, wages and benefits, health and safety, apprenticeship, and a number of other items. And the PLA is a contract, so it can say just about anything. But there are some consistent terms and conditions in PLAs that we see frequently. And the PLA, just as important for you guys on the call, it applies to general contractors, but also subcontractors on a project. And you must agree to the PLA terms and conditions via signing something called a letter of assent. If you don't agree to those terms and conditions, you can't work on a project. And as I'm going to walk through you right now, the PLAs typically contain terms and conditions that are harmful to non-union employees and employers and discourage competition from non-union employers and employees, whether folks realize that or not. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But just big picture, this is a problem because in the construction industry today, 87% of the construction industry does not belong to a union across the country. And as you see from this map, some states have an even higher union density than 87.4%. Those are the red states. And then some states have a lower union density back in the blue states. And it sort of depends on where you are. But bottom line is that the construction industry is largely driven by non-union contractors and workers. And so anytime there's a project labor agreement, they're discouraging competition from the non-union sector. That can be problematic as far as costs and other areas we'll cover today. So basically, what we kind of articulate government mandated PLAs as a way that artificially creates monopolies for unionized contractors and union trade workers on taxpayer funded construction contracts. I'm only talking about government mandated PLAs here. I'm not talking about voluntary PLAs. There are instances where contractors voluntarily execute a PLA with different unions to streamline their collective bargaining agreements. We have no problem with that. Our problem is when the government actually requires this as a condition of performing a contract. When that happens, we feel like competition is disturbed. It discourages competition from quality local contractors and local construction workers not affiliated with unions. And the PLAs often discourage local merit shop contractors from bidding because our contractors typically have their own employees that are not members of union, and they choose not to be members of union for a variety of reasons. So we sort of know there's a number of different reasons why PLAs reduce competition. One is that PLAs force most or all employees from union hiring halls and union apprenticeship programs. So a contractor has to hire their workforce from the union halls or the apprenticeship programs and not use their existing employees. This is a real problem for them. I can't imagine many companies wanting to bid a project and build that project with unfamiliar workers, because they know the productivity, they know the output, they know the safety training, they know the ability of a contractor's workforce when they bid a project. And so getting new people might be problematic in terms of delivering a project safely and on time and on budget to a customer. The other thing I'd say is PLAs force contractors and employees to follow union work rules, which can be inefficient or counterproductive to existing practices by a contractor. They have to follow the work rules contained in the union collective bargaining agreements individually, and this can add additional costs because it eliminates multi-skilling and can be a source of bureaucratic frustration for employers and contractors, which many of you may be familiar with in certain circumstances. And then finally, PLAs force contractors to pay into union benefit plans, including multi-employer union pension plans that can put merit shop contractors at a huge withdrawal liability risk, especially if the plans are underfunded. This is a big issue for a lot of our contractors. They always ask, well, you know, where do I have to pay my benefits to? Can I keep my existing plans or can I not? A lot of the times PLAs force them to pay into union multi-employer pension plans, which can expose them to severe withdrawal liabilities in the future. And then sometimes contractors will pay into the union plans as well as their existing plans, which forces them to have double benefit costs and make them less competitive. PLAs also will harm non-union employees. They force existing local employees to accept union representation as a condition of working on that project without a union representation election or a choice. It's either here's the requirements of the PLA and you're represented by a union or not. There are non-union employees that are allowed to work on PLA projects, but they're few and far between. Most PLAs typically allow what they call a core workforce of maybe 1 out of every 10 workers, and it's capped at maybe 4 or 5 workers overall that can work on there. Those non-union employees are really harmed by PLAs because they're required to pay non-refundable union dues or join a union as a condition of working on that project and earning benefits on that project. And then PLAs typically require non-signatory contractors to pay their employees' health and welfare fringe benefits to union benefit funds, even if they have existing plans. Like I mentioned earlier, that results in a double benefit payment that can be as high as 35%, according to some research that's been done. So that's makes them less competitive, right? And then non-union employees lose any fringe benefits and extra fringe benefits compensation that the employer provides unless they join a union. And research has found that they lose an estimated 34% of wages and benefits on a PLA project. So this demonstrates non-union employees are harmed by PLAs when they're mandated by the government. If you haven't seen this report by Dr. John McGowan with St. Louis University, he published a report in October of 2021, available at buildamericalocal.com, that might be of interest to you if you want to learn more about that side of the equation. The other thing about PLAs I wanted to flag for you is just that it exacerbates the construction industry's skilled labor shortage to some degree. You guys are, I'm sure one of your top issues for all of you is finding skilled labor. And the construction industry unemployment rate is 3.7% right now. And we've rebounded from the total number of people employed during, prior to COVID. We're back to where we were, but we still have a skilled labor shortage of about 650,000 people in 2022 alone. So that is a significant number. And when you require project labor agreements, that will actually exacerbate the skilled labor shortage by cutting out 87% of the construction industry who's non-union. But it also impacts workforce development efforts that are actually underway by a lot of non-union contractors and their partners in the community. PLAs typically force contractors to hire apprentices from union apprenticeship programs. And so non-union contractors who run their own apprenticeship programs or who participate in community or association apprenticeship programs like ABCs, they can't use their apprentices from these programs. They have to hire them from union apprenticeship programs. So by choking off that opportunity for those workers to participate on a project, that can harm the workforce development pipeline in the long run. And ABC members invest about $1.6 billion per year in workforce development altogether, and we've got a variety of courses, including 300 government registered apprenticeship programs in 20 different occupations. And so the PLAs prevent those participants in those government registered programs from participating on projects. For the most part, there are some PLAs that do allow participation from registered apprenticeship programs. They don't specifically say union apprenticeship programs, but most that we've seen say union apprenticeship programs in accordance with their collective bargaining agreements. The other big complaint we hear is from minority contractors, women-owned businesses, veterans, disadvantaged businesses, small businesses. They typically are not unionized, and so they are typically discouraged from competing for construction contracts whenever there's a PLA required. Most of these contractors are small businesses, and in the construction industry, companies who employ less than 100 construction professionals account for 99% of all construction firms in the United States and 68% of all construction industry employment, and they build 63% of construction in the United States by value, and 81% of all construction firms have less than 10 employees. So we're a real small business focused industry. So when small businesses are hurt, the whole industry is hurt. So when you discourage competition from all of these different stakeholders, it's natural that you'd expect increases in the cost of construction. A number of research reports and anecdotal evidence suggests that government mandated PLAs increase the cost of construction between 12% and 20% on average. There's been a number of studies conducted in Connecticut, New York, Ohio, California, Massachusetts, New York. These are all states that already have a prevailing wage, and they've compared the cost of affordable housing subject to prevailing wage with a PLA and without a PLA, and have determined that these school projects and affordable housing projects have an increased cost when PLAs are required. And that's roughly between 12% and 20%. There's also some anecdotal evidence that supports this across the board. If you aren't familiar with these studies and additional research, I encourage you to check out thetruthaboutplas.com and buildamericalocal.com. Great resources on this topic. But people ask, well, why does it cost more? So, where's that 12% to 20% cost come from? And the truth is labor costs, putting inefficient union work rules and lost productivity, that can add costs. The double health and pension costs, any non-union contractors who pursue the PLA project, that's another added cost. Compliance costs, which is getting an attorney to read the PLA, understand how that impacts your business model, bringing in your HR, your payroll, your foreman, and changing your model there. Those are all compliance costs. And then competitive costs, which is when you've got a number of bidders, let's say you have 4 or 5 bidders and 4 out of those 5 are non-union contractors. If you lose those 4 because of a PLA, you only get 1 or maybe 2 unionized contractors and subcontractors participating in the bidding process. When those contractors know that they don't have competition from non-union firms, they don't have to sharpen those pencils as much, and they can provide bids with additional profit margins in there. And so there is an economic correlation between less competition and higher labor and construction costs, which is part of the reason why PLAs tend to increase the cost of construction. So we're out at ABC pushing for fair and open competition, which allows all contractors, both union, both non-union, to participate in government taxpayer funded construction projects. We've got a number of different arguments why this makes sense, which you can see on the screen. And I don't want to elaborate on each of these because we've got a lot to cover, but basically there's a lot of benefits to fair and open competition and letting the best skilled, the best qualified contractors and workers win competitively bid taxpayer funded construction projects. And we've surveyed the public on this, and they support fair and open competition. They want a fair and open competitive bidding process for all contractors, regardless of whether or not their workers are in a union. They generally are opposed to PLAs once they understand what they exactly are. And it's confusing because there are a lot of arguments for PLAs that PLA advocates push. They believe that it's an opportunity to promote workforce development through union apprenticeship programs. It's an opportunity to ensure diversity, diverse workforce, safer job sites, ensure local workers are hired. They're a solution to strikes, quality on time, on budget construction as a result of these. They're used in the private sector and they ensure good wages and benefits. And that's why they think the government should be able to exclude 87% of the construction workforce because they say PLAs offer all of these things. And when you look at these PLAs a little bit closer and greater detail, you do notice that some of these arguments don't hold up. One of the most interesting arguments in support of PLAs that I found is that the unions say, well, if you sign a PLA, we will not strike on a public works project. And that means that the unions will not strike on the projects if the government gives them a monopoly to build that project. And where I'm from, that's kind of a form of coercion. And actually, if you look at the record of strikes and labor unrest on construction projects across the last decade, there actually haven't really been many. There's been only 14 per year in the last decade, which is rather small. So we sort of refer to this argument as an extortionary solution in search of a problem. And then there's other arguments that they talked about too, which is related to the benefits and the wages that workers are paid on a project. Most projects that are subject to a government mandated PLA are already subject to federal prevailing wage laws through the Davis-Bacon Act, which was passed in the 1930s. And if it's not covered by that, it's probably covered by the 28 states that have state prevailing wage laws. There's also localities that have prevailing wage laws. And typically what you find is that prevailing wage laws require contractors to pay a wage and benefit rate that's set by the government, which is typically close or at the union scale wages at the time. So the arguments that PLAs are needed to ensure workers are paid high wages, it's already covered by prevailing wage laws. The other arguments is about safety. There's really not a lot of data suggesting that PLAs keep workers more safe or lack of PLAs leads to higher injuries and fatalities. We've looked at a number of different data points on this and really no conclusion can be drawn from that. It's another thing to consider on this debate. And finally, I'll just mention that we do have a number of states that have passed legislation restricting government mandated PLAs on state and perhaps state assisted and local construction projects. We have not seen evidence in these states that have led to higher increases in safety issues or delayed projects or a lack of on time and on budget construction that can be related directly to lack of PLA. We've had 27 states pass these laws since 2009, and that was the year that President Obama issued an executive order encouraging the use of project labor agreements on federal contracts exceeding $25 million. And these states typically are Republican-led states, push back on these PLAs at the federal level and pushes for PLAs on federally assisted projects by passing these state laws. And again, these laws do not prohibit government mandated PLA. I'm sorry, they do not prohibit voluntary PLAs. They only prohibit government mandated PLAs.
Ben, that brings up a good question. Does Biden's executive order preempt the state laws as it sits right now for the contracts that fall under the executive order?
That's a great question. So the Biden executive order only speaks to federal construction projects right now. So federal contracts are occurring on Navy bases, Army Corps bases, Veterans Affairs hospitals, GSA buildings. Those are subject to federal procurement laws and federal rules. It doesn't matter whether those projects happen in a state that has the law, the FOCA law, or it happens in a blue state. It doesn't matter. The Biden order only applies to federal contracts itself. I will talk about federally assisted projects, which they're pushing PLAs on too, independent of the executive order. That's where things get a little bit sticky. That's where we're seeing more and more conflicts between perhaps this law and the intent of the Biden administration, which
that's what I was leaning towards is these federally assisted projects, the flow down money from the federal government for the Department of Education for the construction of schools and how that might play into this.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I'll get to that when I'm talking about the policies a little bit more, just to clarify that. But that's a great question. That's where we get a lot of questions and confusion from the government contractors and from private contractors, and also lawmakers and regulators. They don't quite understand the difference there. So I'll get into that. That's great. So I've given you an overview about like what is a government mandated PLA, the pros, the cons, and like why they're there. And really, it's all about politics. In my opinion, and what we've seen, this is really an opportunity for certain lawmakers to basically create an opportunity to give their donors and their base more public works contracts, and that the unions are the ones that benefit from this, and the unions are then going to basically get more people elected who believe in PLAs, and it's sort of what they call negative feedback loop. And we look at the contributions of the NAB2 unions, which is the construction trade unions umbrella organization, and we look at their federal PACs, and we see how much they raise every year, which is north of I guess $62 million in the last election cycle, what they dispersed. And we've looked at what they've given to federal candidates, for example, and they've given almost 90% to Democrats, 10% to Republicans. And so this is part of their legislative agenda, try to create more work for their membership, try to create more work for their signatory contractors. And part of this is part of the policy of supporting lawmakers who believe in that. And, when President Biden was elected, it was no surprise. He said he wanted to be the most pro-union president, ever. And he said that on the campaign trail. And he said that in his first year and second year of his administration. So really not a surprise at all. And this is an opportunity for him to use the power of the White House and the executive agencies to send work to unionized contractors and create jobs for union labor. And I don't think I've heard him once say, we're investing in the infrastructure bill to create jobs for all Americans. We've heard him say, we're going to create good paying union jobs. And even though non-union contractors will benefit from the infrastructure bill to some degree, we're not hearing that as a talking point, creating opportunity for everybody. So it has left a lot of the folks on the non-union ledger in the construction industry frustrated with the administration. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But so President Biden walked into the White House, with his infrastructure plan, the infrastructure bill that the Trump administration couldn't get over the line. He wanted to have project labor agreements on everything. He wanted to pass the PRO Act. He wanted to do a lot of things that would benefit the unions because he wants to be the most pro-union president around. And for whatever reason, the legislative process sort of went a different way than the Biden administration wanted. And they actually passed an infrastructure bill with about $550 billion worth of additional infrastructure money above baseline amounts. And ABC, as well as ESA, were part of a broad coalition that pushed back on project labor requirements in the legislation. And we ran a campaign that was successful, and they ended up not having PLA requirements or encouragements in the actual legislation. We had a buildamericalocal.com coalition website that I mentioned earlier, as well as some digital advocacy and some other efforts across the board for educational efforts to push back on that. So that was a successful campaign. Unfortunately, right after, and this, by the way, is just an overview of the infrastructure bill, different programs in there. But unfortunately, after it was signed into law in February, a couple months later, the Biden administration issued an executive order requiring PLAs, as was mentioned earlier, on federal contracts of $35 million or more. And it's not a $25 million threshold, it's $35 million. 25 million was the threshold the Obama administration used previously, but that threshold was not a direct mandate across the board. It was an encouragement on a case-by-case basis. This order by the Biden administration says it's a requirement across the board. There may be some exceptions to that requirement across the board. We'll know more about this once the FAR Council, which is the Federal Acquisition and Regulatory Council, issues a proposed rule and then eventually a final rule implementing this. That will describe possible opportunities for exemptions. But we expected this to be issued by June 9th. It hasn't come out yet, so we're still waiting. But as a reminder, this only applies to direct federal construction contracts, does not apply to federally assisted construction contracts. But like I said earlier, other federal agency grant programs are pushing PLAs on state and local projects receiving federal dollars. And so ABC and our coalition is going to continue to fight against these government mandated PLAs on federal contracts and federally assisted contracts. We're keeping this issue radioactive. We've got an aggressive PR and grassroots strategy. We're going to look at a legal challenge and go from there. But I wanted to just kind of flag this for everybody. We've been doing a lot of work on pushing back on this and in the various newspapers and and online places where we share information, and hopefully the word is getting out on this. And if you can amplify this message anywhere internally within your colleagues and your peers and other stakeholders, that'd be great, especially when we know the proposed rule is going to be coming out shortly. We're going to do another pushback on this as well, and we'd love for your help to push back on that. But largely, the PLA threat under the Obama years, which I mentioned earlier, was actually not much of a threat. ABC and our coalition of stakeholders pushed back on PLAs during that time period, and there were only 12 contracts out of almost more than 2,000 contracts that had a PLA required on that. So really impressive batting average, if you will, as far as advocacy and pushing back on these PLAs. We thought back in 2009 that there would be, hundreds of PLAs and more prohibitions on non-union contractors moving forward, and that didn't happen. But of note, what's interesting is the Trump administration didn't rescind the Obama administration's executive order. They left that in place. And we looked and found during this time period how many ABC members won federal contracts over $25 million. And it was more than 50% of the contracts. So our members, ABC members specifically, were able to win 50% or more of those prime contracts. And a lot of those contracts presumably flow down to subcontractors that were ABC members and even non-ABC members as a result of that. So the Biden administration is really trying to change that narrative and have more contracts go to unionized contractors and more contracts go to union labor through PLAs. And that's why they've got this across the board requirement. At least that's what's in the executive order so far. Outside of the executive order, we are seeing a number of projects come out, a number of grant programs from each of these federal agencies encouraging or requiring PLAs on grant programs that states and localities are applying and competing for under some of their discretionary grant programs. And this is federally assisted dollars. So these are projects procured by state and local governments, but they're getting money from DOT or the Treasury or Interior or Agriculture. And they're basically being told, look, if you want this money, if you want to have a strong application, we encourage you to admit or require project labor agreements on these state and local construction projects. So if you don't do it, you're less likely to get this funding, or you actually can't get this funding unless you do it, depending on the structure of the grant program. ABC's got a list of the identified grant programs so far at abc.org/PLA grants. I encourage you to take a look at that to see if there's any programs that you're looking at that might fund some security projects as a result of that grant money. But these are projects that like we mentioned earlier, there's some states that have passed laws restricting government mandated PLAs. Those states theoretically shouldn't be requiring PLAs or encouraging their use. Does this mean that those states will get less money in the competitive grant making process? I think that's an open question. It remains to be seen. It's going to be hard to know broadly what happens with that until all the chips are on the table later on down the road. But we've definitely flagged this for states and governors and attorneys generals, and they are very interested in this. They are very frustrated about this process. They want local control in a lot of these procurements. They don't need additional red tape and pushes and nudges to benefit special interests in the procurement of these critical projects in their states. So we're looking for additional kind of narrative on what happens there. We really don't know how many federally assisted projects are subject to PLAs historically. We do know that there's one office, the DOT, Federal Highway Administration, FHWA. They actually track PLAs on projects approved by state and local governments. And we know that was about 606 contracts from about May 2010 to February 22. And that was about $16 billion worth of work. But we don't know that in other agencies, so we have no idea what that looks like. Just to give you guys some perspective, the federal government procures about $30 billion worth of federal construction contracts per year. And the state and local area, they call it public works construction. That's probably more like $350 billion a year. So federal contracting is about 10% of the overall pie in the public works space. So federally assisted projects, they think about 2/3 of all projects get some federal dollars. According to some estimates, I don't know if that might be a little bit high, but bottom line is that more and more projects are getting some federal money as a result of the infrastructure bill and as a result of other efforts. And I think we could see more and more of this push for PLAs across the board, which could be problematic. We have some solutions here and some resources I want to share with your team, Chris. But one thing that we're pushing at ABC, and which ESA is pushing and our coalition is pushing, is legislation called the Fair and Open Competition Act, which is introduced by Senator Todd Young from Indiana and Representative Ted Budd from North Carolina. And by the way, Representative Budd is running for a Senate seat and likely to be the next senator from North Carolina if things go his way. So interesting person to watch on this issue. But this was similar to the focus statutes at the state level I mentioned. It would restrict government mandated PLAs on federal contracts as well as federally assisted contracts. We know that this will not pass in the current Congress. We know President Biden would not sign this legislation if it came to his desk. But we do know that this is the best solution to fighting back against PLA requirements, which is why we're asking all of our stakeholders to make sure their members of Congress are co-sponsors for this bill and are aware of it and can support it when the election changes. Maybe there'll be some different parties in power that are more open to allowing all of America's construction industry to compete for these contracts. So that's our big legislative push. And then we also have the websites if you want to learn more about this at thetruthaboutplas.com, as well as our coalition website, buildamericalocal.com. So I'll give you some more resources on how we're fighting back and what you can do. But I just want to stop and see, Chris, if there are any other questions that came up and if there's any other things I can elaborate on. I covered quite a bit there today so far.
No, yes, we do have one question so far that came kind of early on, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow of your discussion because it's very, very good. And but it bears repeating and reemphasizing. The question was, does this equally affect prime versus subcontractors? And I think that's important to kind of reemphasize that point.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question I get all the time. Some subcontractors are like, oh, don't worry about it. The prime signs the PLA. It doesn't apply to me. I'm special. Yeah, you're wrong. It applies to general contractors and subcontractors. If you want to work on that project, you got to sign the PLA, the letter of assent. You got to agree to the terms and conditions of the PLA, as well as the respective collective bargaining agreements for each of the unions you might be doing and engage with. So, and sometimes contractors don't even realize, well, hey, my worker touched this certain tool or did this certain type of behavior on a job site. They may not even realize that under the PLA that actually forces you to agree and be bound by the terms of a collective bargaining agreement of a union you may not even be familiar with, depending on the jurisdiction. So it's something to be aware of if you're considering signing a PLA. I get calls all the time from contractors saying, hey, do you think I can sign this PLA? What are my risks? And I talk about that, knowing which collective bargaining agreements are applicable to you, understanding the master collective bargaining agreement, understanding your pension and benefit contribution requirements, and then understanding which of your employees, if any, you can bring on a job site. How do you manage that risk? How do you put together a bid? And how do you deliver that project on time and on budget with all of those unknowns and uncertainties? And then once they assess this, most contractors take a sober look at this and say, okay, I can't bid on this project, or I won't bid on this project. And there are some non-union contractors that do bid on these PLA projects. Some of them don't self-perform the work. They're prime contractors. They pass this through. Some of them, I guess, figure out this is a risk worth taking because of their certain circumstances. Sometimes you hear bad stories about it, and sometimes you don't really hear anything afterwards. So you don't really know how this worked out. And a lot of these stories are open-ended because they might have pension withdrawal liabilities that they might not know about until 10 years from now. So a little unclear how that works out for those firms. But for the most part, non-union contractors won't bid and work on PLA projects.
And that prompts another question when it comes to the laws of supply and demand from a labor perspective. The thing that popped out in my head while you were discussing this is, you have a huge workforce development skills gap as it exists now, even without this order being rolled out and completely in effect. Imagine all of these federal contracts that are going to be subject to PLAs, and you don't have enough workers, union or non-union, to begin with. How is requiring a PLA going to further exacerbate the supply and demand for labor, and how is that going to impact federal construction costs and timelines?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so when I speak to the different federal agencies that our members build with, and the contracting officers, and even people above the contracting officers, in charge of construction programs, privately say, hey, look, like our biggest challenge before the pandemic was skilled labor shortage. It's even worse now. The construction workforce is aging out, or they've gone into other industries, or there's been a lack of workforce development at the schools, putting people in technical trades and getting into the industry. There's a perfect storm of reasons why the construction industry has a skilled labor shortage. But they're like, this is going to make this 10 times worse. You can't do this by cutting out 87% of the industry. A lot of the contracting officers on federal projects down in the South are like, there are no union contractors to do this work in my state. Like, these people are going to come in from out of state with unionized workers, and it's going to be more expensive. It's at the expense of our local industry. Like, they're frustrated. Like, I don't want to see this happen. This is bad policy. But you're asking a question about the costs. And we know under normal circumstances, PLAs increase costs between 12% and 20%. This environment, it may be much more than that, and we don't really know. And by the way, we have material costs that have already escalated 44% on non-residential construction since before the pandemic. So we're dealing with tons of other budgetary constraints independent of the PLA issue. So this is kind of like one bad policy that's going to pile on to a bunch of terrible things that are really happening in the industry. I think we're starting to hear from our contractors that some public works projects are getting paused or delayed or canceled because their budget doesn't allow for these added material costs. And then if you add labor cost issues on top of that, that spells like there's going to be some projects that are planned that are going to get cut back or delayed until things smooth out after the pandemic. So, for those of you who are pro-taxpayer and are concerned about taxpayer investment in infrastructure, we're spending $550 billion more on the new infrastructure bill on infrastructure than we were over baseline amounts. And because of the material cost escalation and because of policies like these, taxpayers are going to get less bang for their buck. They're going to get fewer roads, schools, bridges, and other public infrastructure needs as a result of this. And that's just bad policy as far as we're concerned, especially when you're cutting out so many qualified contractors and workers who just want to rebuild their country and their community, and they pay taxes on this stuff, and they should have an opportunity to compete. So hopefully that's helpful for you, Chris.
Certainly. Another question that came to my mind is in reading the executive order, section 7, and I'll just read it here real quickly. It says, nothing in this order precludes an agency from requiring the use of a project labor agreement in circumstances not covered by this order, including projects where the total cost of the federal government is less than that for a large-scale construction project, or projects receiving any form of federal financial assistance, including loans, loan guarantees, revolving funds, tax credits, and cooperative agreements. So this executive order also opens the door for federal agencies to, on their own, require PLAs for any of these federally assisted projects, include grants and which you discussed. What do you think the penetration of the extension of PLAs may be with some of these federal agencies versus others?
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Chris.
No, I just overall, what's the potential impact of section 7 of this executive order on taxpayers and on contractors and subcontractors? Yeah, so
under the Obama era executive order, which by the way is still in place until the final rule is issued on the Biden order, but the federal agencies were allowed to require PLAs or encourage their use or fund projects that had a PLA required by the local level. We just didn't see that often. It was pretty unusual. So the current posture of the Biden administration is very unusual. We are seeing a lot of these grant programs, and almost every discretionary grant program where the states and localities are competing for the project, we're seeing language in there related to PLAs and other union objectives and things that they like. But we're seeing this either as a requirement or seeing it as an encouragement. And the goal here is to entice these state and local providers of construction services that get these federal dollars to use PLAs and create more work for unionized contractors and union workers. And it's hard to know which agency is going to have more PLAs as a result of them, because we really don't know how this will all shake out until probably the procurements are issued. And by the way, a lot of states aren't even close to really procuring contracts funded by the infrastructure bill yet. They are still getting money from the federal agencies related to ARPA, which had $350 billion of money for water, sewer, and broadband. They're still contemplating how to spend that money and get that money through the pipeline. So the infrastructure money is probably not going to hit, at least the discretionary grant stuff is not going to hit for quite some time, probably, later this year, early next year at the earliest. And then you've got to go through the procurement process for each of those identified projects. So it's going to take some time to know the impact of this on federal contracts as well as federally assisted contracts. But my sense is this is a lot more aggressive and a bigger departure than the Obama era policy, and it's going to have a bigger impact on ESA members as well as the broader construction industry, which is why ABC is fighting back on this with everyone else, and we're trying to get the word out that if you're counting on this work, make sure you understand this issue and are approaching it appropriately.
And I got one final thought or question for you, Ben. With the political landscape the way it is right now, of course, depending on the pundits that you listen to, if Republicans were to take control of the House and the Senate next year, the FOCA Act, the Fair and Open Competition Act, which would preempt this executive order for all practical purposes, even if it did pass, it would likely get vetoed by Biden, we assume, and we'd still be where we are for the next 2.5 years. So even if we do, even if Republicans do manage to capture both houses, it's not likely the executive order is going to be challenged unless it's challenged in court. Is that your assessment right now?
Yeah, that's right. And it's a good segue into sort of my final slides, which are action items you can take. I mean, I tell our members, we have a motto at ABC: get into politics or get out of business, and that's because elections matter. And
I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
I'm gonna steal that.
We've had that trademark, so be careful, Chris. But yeah, we've been using that for 40 years plus, and our members believe it, right? They understand what this means, especially the public contractors. So look, elections matter. Folks who believe in free enterprise are not in the majority in either chamber right now or in the White House. So that is obviously a big concern for them. Fortunately, we're in a marketplace where there's a lot of work everywhere, so people can kind of go into the private sector or find work to do. But I was around during the last recession, and people had no work, and they were going after the government work like crazy because that was the only game in town. And we might see that happen if things get really bad in the recession that we're in, or maybe about to be in, or depending on how you look at it. But getting back to your point, you're right. This focused legislation is not going to be signed into law next year. You really have to wait until you have a merit shot majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House for this to happen. And I think that litigation is really the only opportunity to push back on the executive order once we see the final rule come out. So stay tuned on that. I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more from us once the proposed rule comes out. There'll be an opportunity to participate in that regulatory process that hopefully your members will take advantage of, and ABC will be part of that. But in the meantime, it's also an educational effort of lawmakers. So we're in the middle of primary season right now, and we've got big elections coming up, obviously in November. So I always encourage our members, and maybe ESA members would be interested in having lawmakers out to visits on job sites or industry events or apprenticeship events, where you can show them, the kind of businesses that you operate. You guys are good, strong employers. You pay good wages. Your employees are happy, so that when you do talk to them about how these policies impact them, they know that you're not some fly-by-night contractor. They know you're a legitimate business. This is a real concern, and it's a real concern for your diverse workforce and your local workforce. So we've been having lawmakers who haven't been with us on this issue out to our programs, and they're blown away. They're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know you have apprenticeship programs, and you've got tons of local people employed." And sometimes that works. That helps them reevaluate their position. So that's the elections have consequences. This is where we're at right now. outside of legal action, I don't think much will change. Although Republicans, if they do take the House, I will say, have the ability to have more oversight and conduct hearings and shed some light on this issue. We haven't seen that at all in this Congress, obviously. And they have limited ability to do anything when they're a minority, so they can do that. And I think that will be helpful in pushing back on this, especially when it's the infrastructure bill funding is not going to be as valuable as it was when it was passed a couple of years passed last year. There's going to be cost increases and projects canceled as a result of the variety of factors I discussed earlier.
Right. Well, and I am looking forward to seeing if the Republicans do take control, them seizing on this is one of the issues that really need to be addressed, especially as it rolls out and we start seeing the negative effect of it. I think that's when we're really going to capture people's attention. Ben, I'm sorry, did you have any final thoughts?
No, well, I just wanted to plug, we have an action app called the ABC Action app, which you can download on the iPad or iPhone or Android from the different app stores. And that's a great way to stay engaged on this issue. We'll have alerts about the proposed rule and ways you can participate in the rulemaking, as well as any legislative pushes on this topic and other issues of importance to ABC. If you haven't downloaded it, I encourage you to take a look at it. It's a good way to stay on top of it. I'm sure ESA has really good grassroots efforts. I've seen some of the stuff you've done on this too, but it might be another thing I'm happy to plug if that's all right.
Certainly, and we will be pushing the FOCA Act again when when it becomes viable, like a committee hearing is scheduled or something starts working, it's showing signs of moving. Obviously, we will push to our members through our app and through our advocacy grassroots campaigns to make sure our members chime in on that issue as well.
Yeah. So, I'd say the closing thoughts are, if you listen to today's presentation, you're concerned about how this might impact your company and your employees, I'd say start having conversations with your prime contractors and folks that you work with closely, and those customers you have in the government space, and explain your concerns about this, both for federal contracts, if you're a federal contractor, as well as on state and local projects. If those projects are getting federal dollars, I think you've just got to proactively educate them about this issue. ABC is happy to do that. If you need help with that, we've got a number of other coalition members that do that too. But it's going to be a big fight for a lot of people coming up in the next couple of years as these policies get finalized and actually out there into the wild. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you about this topic. It's in the weeds. Not a lot of people understand it, but once you get it, you're like, how is this legal? Why is this permissible? This is like corruption, right? Isn't this government corruption? Are we steering contracts to special interests?
Picking winners and losers. Yeah, right. Winners and losers. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we're happy to shed light on this, and appreciate the opportunity, Chris, to talk to ESA and the industry, and happy to take any questions. You feel free to email me at brubeck@abc.org. We also have a Twitter handle that posts interesting policy issues at ABC Gov Affairs that you can stay on top of the news if you're a Twitter fanatic, which I'm sure some of you guys are. But appreciate all you guys are doing out there in the fields and building America and keeping everyone safe. So thank you for what you do. And Chris, thank you for your leadership. It's been a pleasure working with you over the last few years on this issue and other issues too. So keep up the good work. You guys are lucky to have Chris and the ESA team holding the flag for all of you.
Ben, I really appreciate it. And I really thank you for taking the time today. And Jillian?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ben. Barring there are no additional questions, I'd like to thank all of the security pros for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next ESA webinar. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Thanks a lot.